such thing as art. There are only artists. Once there were men who took colored earth and roughed out the forms of a bison on the wall of a cave. Today, some buy their paints and design posters for hoardings. They did and do many other things. There is no harm in calling all these activities art, as long as we keep in mind that such a word may mean very different things in different times and places. As long as we realize that art with a capital A has no existence. For art with a capital A has come to be something of a bogey and a fetish. You may crush an artist by telling him that what he has just done may be quite good in its own way, only it is not art. And you may confound anyone enjoying a picture by declaring that what he liked in it was not the art, but something different. Actually, I do not think that there are any wrong reasons for liking a statue or a picture. Someone may like a landscape painting because it reminds him of home, or a portrait because it reminds him of a friend. There is nothing wrong with that. All of us, when we see a painting, are bound to be reminded of 101 things which influence our likes and dislikes. As long as these memories help us to enjoy what we see, we need not worry. It is only when some irrelevant memory makes us prejudiced, when we instinctively turn away from a magnificent picture of an alpine scene because we dislike climbing, that we should search our mind for the reason for the aversion which spoils a pleasure we might otherwise have had. There are wrong reasons for disliking a work of art. Most people like to see in pictures what they would also like to see in reality. This is quite a natural preference. We all like beauty in nature and are grateful to the artists who have preserved it in their works. Nor would these artists themselves have rebuffed us for our taste. When the great Flemish painter Rubens made a drawing of his little boy, he was surely proud of his good looks. He wanted us, too, to admire the child. But this bias for the pretty and engaging subject is apt to become a stumbling block if it leads us to reject works which represent a less appealing subject. The great German painter Albrecht Durer certainly drew his mother with as much devotion and love as Rubens felt for his chubby child. His truthful study of careworn old age may give us a shock which makes us turn away from it. And yet, if we fight against our first repugnance, we may be richly rewarded. For Durer's drawing, in its tremendous sincerity, is a great work. In fact, we shall soon discover the beauty of a picture does not really lie in the beauty of its subject matter. I do not know whether the little ragamuffins whom the Spanish painter Murillo liked to paint were strictly beautiful or not, but as he painted them, they certainly have great charm. On the other hand, most people would call the child in Pieter de Hooch's wonderful Dutch interior plain, but it is an attractive picture all the same. The trouble about beauty is that tastes and standards of what is beautiful vary so much. Figures 5 and 6 were both painted in the 15th century, and both represent angels playing the lute. Many will prefer the Italian work by Melozzo di Forli with its appealing grace and charm to that of its northern contemporary, Hans Memling. I myself like both. It may take a little longer to discover the intrinsic beauty of Memling's angel, but once we are no longer disturbed by his faint awkwardness, we may find him infinitely lovable. What is true of beauty is also true of expression. In fact, it is often the expression of a figure in the painting which makes us like or loathe the work. Some people like an expression which they can easily understand, and which therefore moves them profoundly. When the 17th century Italian painter Guido Reni painted the head of Christ on the cross, he intended no doubt that the beholder should find in this face all the agony and all the glory of the Passion. Many people throughout subsequent centuries have drawn strength and comfort from such a representation of the Savior. The feeling it expresses is so strong and so clear that copies of this work can be found in simple wayside shrines and remote farmhouses where people know nothing about art. But even if this intense expression of feeling appeals to us, we should not, for that reason, turn away from works whose expression is perhaps less easy to understand. The Italian painter of the Middle Ages, who painted the crucifix, surely felt as sincerely about the Passion as did Rennie. But we must first learn to know his methods of drawing to understand his feelings. When we have come to understand these different languages, we may even prefer works of art whose expression is less obvious than Rennie's. Just as some prefer people who use few words and gestures and leave something to be guessed, so some people are fond of paintings or sculptures which leave them something to guess and ponder about. In the more primitive periods, when artists were not as skilled in representing human faces and human gestures as they are now, it is often all the more moving to see how they tried, nevertheless, to bring out the feeling they wanted to convey. But here, newcomers to art are often brought up against another difficulty. They want to admire the artist's skill in representing the things they see. What they like best are paintings which look real. I do not deny for a moment that this is an important consideration. The patience and skill which go into the faithful rendering of the visible world are indeed to be admired. Great artists of the past have devoted much labor to works in which every tiny detail is carefully recorded. Durer's watercolor study of a hare is one of the most famous examples of this loving patience. But who would say that Rembrandt's drawing of an elephant is necessarily less good because it shows fewer details? Indeed, Rembrandt was such a wizard that he gave us the feel of the elephant's wrinkly skin with a few lines of chalk. But it is not sketchiness that mainly offends people who like their pictures to look real. They are even more repelled by works which they consider to be incorrectly drawn, particularly when they belong to a more modern period, when the artist ought to have known better. As a matter of fact, there is no mystery about these distortions of nature about which we still hear complaints in discussions on modern art. Everyone who has seen a Disney film or a comic strip knows all about that. He knows that it is sometimes right to draw things otherwise than they look, to change and distort them in one way or another. Mickey Mouse does not look very much like a real mouse, yet people do not write indignant letters to the papers about the length of his tail. Those who enter Disney's enchanted world are not worried about art with a capital A. They do not watch his films armed with the same prejudices they like to take with them when going to an exhibition of modern painting. But if a modern artist draws something in his own way, he is apt to be thought a bungler who can do no better. Now, whatever we may think of modern artists, we may safely credit them with enough knowledge to draw correctly. If they do not do so, their reasons may be very similar to those of Walt Disney. Figure 11 shows a plate from an illustrated natural history by the famous pioneer of the modern movement, Picasso. Surely no one could find fault with his charming representation of a mother hen and her fluffy chicks. But in drawing a cockerel in figure 12, Picasso was not content with giving a mere rendering of the bird's appearance. He wanted to bring out its aggressiveness, its cheek, and its stupidity. In other words, he resorted to caricature. But what a convincing caricature it is. There are two things, therefore, which we should always ask ourselves if we find fault in the accuracy of a picture. One is whether the artist may not have had his reason for changing the appearance of what he saw. We shall hear more about such reasons as the story of art unfolds. The other is that we should never condemn a work for being incorrectly drawn unless we have made quite sure that we are right and the painter is wrong. We are all inclined to be quick with the verdict that things do not look like that. We have a curious habit of thinking that nature must always look like the pictures we are accustomed to. It is easy to illustrate this by an astonishing discovery which was made not very long ago. Generations have watched horses gallop, have attended horse races and hunts, have enjoyed paintings and sporting prints showing horses charging into battle or running after hounds. Not one of these people seems to have noticed what it really looks like when a horse runs. Pictures and sporting prints usually showed them with outstretched legs in full flight through the air, as the great 19th century French painter Theodore Gericult painted them in a famous representation of the races at Epsom. About 50 years later, when the photographic camera had been sufficiently perfected for snapshots of horses in rapid motion to be taken, these snapshots proved that both the painters and their public had been wrong all the while. No galloping horse ever moved in the way which seems so natural to us. As the legs come off the ground, they are moved in turn for the next kickoff. If we reflect for a moment, we shall realize that it could hardly get along otherwise. And yet, when painters begin to apply this new discovery and painted horses moving as they actually do, everyone complained that their pictures looked wrong. This, no doubt, is an extreme example, but similar errors are by no means as rare as one might think. We are all inclined to accept conventional forms or colors as the only correct ones. Children sometimes think that stars must be star-shaped, although naturally they are not. The people who insist that in a picture the sky must be blue and the grass green are not very different from these children. They get indignant if they see other colors in a picture. But if we try to forget all we have heard about green grass and blue skies and look at the world as if we had just arrived from another planet on a voyage of discovery and were seeing it for the first time, we may find that things are apt to have the most surprising colors. Now, painters sometimes feel as if they were on such a voyage of discovery. They want to see the world afresh and to discard all the accepted notions and prejudices about flesh being pink and apples yellow or red. It is not easy to get rid of these preconceived ideas, but the artists who succeed best in doing so often produce the most exciting works. It is they who teach us to see in nature new beauties of whose existence we have never dreamt. If we follow them and learn from them, even a glance out of our own window may become a thrilling adventure. There is no greater obstacle to the enjoyment of great works of art than our unwillingness to discard habits and prejudices. A painting which represents a familiar subject in an unexpected way is often condemned for no better reason than that it does not seem right. The more often we have seen a story represented in art, the more firmly do we become convinced that it must always be represented on similar lines. About biblical subjects in particular, feelings are apt to run high. Though we all know that the scriptures tell us nothing about the appearance of Jesus and that God himself cannot be visualized in human form, and though we know that it was the artists of the past who first created the images we have become used to, some are still inclined to think that to depart from these traditional forms amounts to blasphemy. As a matter of fact, it was usually those artists who read the scriptures with the greatest devotion and attention who tried to build up in their minds an entirely fresh picture of the incidents of the sacred story. They tried to forget all the paintings they had seen and to imagine what it must have been like when the Christ child lay in the manger and the shepherds came to adore him, or when a fisherman began to preach the gospel. It has happened time and time again that such efforts of a great artist to read the old text with entirely fresh eyes have shocked and outraged thoughtless people. A typical scandal of this kind flared up around Caravaggio, a very bold and revolutionary Italian painter who worked round about 1600. He was given the task of painting a picture of Saint Matthew for the altar of a church in Rome. The saint was to be represented writing the gospel, and to show that the gospels were the word of God, an angel was to be represented inspiring his writings. Caravaggio, who was a highly imaginative and uncompromising young artist, thought hard about what it must have been like when an elderly, poor working man, a simple publican, suddenly had to sit down to write a book. And so he painted a picture of St. Matthew in figure 15 with a bald head and bare dusty feet awkwardly gripping the huge volume, anxiously wrinkling his brow under the unaccustomed strain of writing. By his side he painted a youthful angel who seems just to have arrived on high, who gently guides the laborer's hand as a teacher might do a child. When Caravaggio delivered this picture to the church where it was to be placed on the altar, people were scandalized at what they took to be a lack of respect for the saint. The painting was not accepted, and Caravaggio had to try again. This time he took no chances. He kept strictly to the conventional ideas of what an angel and a saint look like in figure 16. The outcome is still quite a good picture, for Caravaggio tried hard to make it look lively and interesting, but we feel that it is less honest and sincere than the first picture had been. The story illustrates the harm that may be done by those who dislike and criticize works of art for the wrong reasons. What is more important, it brings home to us that what we call works of art are not the results of some mysterious activity, but objects made by human beings for human beings. A picture looks so remote when it hangs glazed and framed on the wall, and in our museums it is very properly forbidden to touch the objects on view. But originally they were made to be touched and handled. They were bargained about, quarreled about, worried about. Let us also remember that every one of their features is the result of a decision by the artist, that he may have pondered over them and changed them many times, that he may have wondered whether to leave that tree in the background or to paint it over again, that he may have been pleased by a lucky stroke of his brush, which gave a sudden, unexpected brilliance to a sunlit cloud, and that he put in these figures reluctantly at the insistence of a buyer. For most of the paintings and statues which are now lined up along the walls of our museums and galleries were not meant to be displayed as art. They were made for a definite occasion and a definite purpose, which were in the artist's mind when he set to work. Those ideas, on the other hand, that we outsiders usually worry about, ideas about beauty and expression, are rarely mentioned by artists. It was not always like that, but it was for so many centuries in the past, and it is so again now. The reason is partly that artists are often shy people who would think it embarrassing to use big words like beauty. They would feel rather priggish if they were to speak about expressing their emotions and to use similar catchwords. Such things they take for granted and find it useless to discuss. That is one reason, and it seems a good one. But there is another. In the actual everyday worries of the artist, these ideas play a much smaller part than the outsiders would, I think, suspect. What an artist worries about as he plans his pictures, makes his sketches, or wonders whether he has completed his canvas is something much more difficult to put into words. Perhaps he would say he worries about whether he has got it right. Now, it is only when we understand what he means by that modest little word, right, that we begin to understand what artists are really after. I think we can only hope to understand this if we draw on our own experience. Of course, we are no artists. We may never have tried to paint a picture and may have no intention of ever doing so. But this need not mean that we are never confronted with problems similar to those which make up the artist's life. In fact, I am anxious to prove that there is hardly any person who has not got at least an inkling of this type of problem, be it in ever so modest a way. Anybody who has ever tried to arrange a bunch of flowers, to shuffle and shift the colors, to add a little here and take away there, has experienced this strange sensation of balancing forms and colors without being able to tell exactly what kind of harmony it is he's trying to achieve. We just feel a patch of red here may make all the difference, or this blue is all right by itself, but it does not go with the others. And suddenly a little stem of green leaves may seem to make it come right. Don't touch it anymore, we exclaim. Now it is perfect. Nobody, I admit, is quite so careful over the arrangement of flowers, but nearly everybody has something he wants to get right. It may just be a matter of finding the right belt to match a certain dress, or nothing more impressive than the worry over the right proportion of, say, pudding and cream on one's plate. In every such case, however trivial, we may feel that a shade too much or too little upsets the balance, and that there is only one relationship which is as it should be. People who worry like this over flowers, dresses, or food, we may call fussy because we may feel these things do not warrant so much attention. But what may sometimes be a bad habit in daily life, and is often therefore suppressed or concealed, comes into its own in the realm of art. When it is a matter of matching forms or arranging colors, an artist must always be fussy, or rather fastidious, to the extreme. He may see differences in shades and texture which we could hardly notice. Moreover, his task is infinitely more complex than any of those we may experience in ordinary life. He has not only to balance 2 or 3 colors or shapes or tastes, but to juggle with any number. He has on his canvas, perhaps, hundreds of shades and forms which he must balance until they look right. A patch of green may suddenly look too yellow because it was brought into close proximity with a strong blue. He may feel that all is spoiled, and there is a jarring note in the picture that he must begin it all over again. He may suffer agonies over this problem. He may ponder about it in sleepless nights. He may stand in front of his picture all day trying to add a touch of color here or there and rubbing it out again, though you and I might not have noticed the difference either way. But once he has succeeded, we all feel that he has achieved something to which nothing could be added, something which is right, an example of perfection in our very imperfect world. Take one of Raphael's famous Madonnas, the Virgin in the Meadow, for instance. It is beautiful, no doubt, and engaging. The figures are admirably drawn, and the expression of the Holy Virgin as she looks down on the two children is quite unforgettable. But if we look at Raphael's sketches for the picture in figure 18, we begin to realize that these were not the things he took most trouble about. These he took for granted. What he tried again and again to get was the right balance between the figures, the right relationship which would make the most harmonious whole. In the rapid sketch in the left-hand corner, he thought of letting the Christ child walk away, looking back and up at his mother, and he tried different positions of the mother's head to answer the movement of the child. Then he decided to turn the child round and to let him look up at her. He tried another way, this time introducing the little St. John, but instead of letting the Christ child look at him, made him turn out of the picture. Then he made another attempt and apparently became impatient, trying the head of the child in many different positions. There were several leaves of this kind in this sketchbook, in which he searched again and again to find how best to balance these three figures. But if we now look back at the final picture, we see that he did get it right in the end. Everything in the picture seems in its proper place, and the pose and harmony Raphael has achieved by his hard work seems so natural and effortless that we hardly notice them. Yet it is just this harmony which makes the beauty of the Madonna more beautiful and the sweetness of the children more sweet. It is fascinating to watch an artist thus striving to achieve the right balance. But if we were to ask him why he did this or changed that, he might not be able to tell us. He does not follow any fixed rules. He just feels this way. It is true that some artists or critics in certain periods have tried to formulate laws of their art, but it always turned out that poor artists did not achieve anything when trying to apply these laws, while great masters could break them and yet achieve a new kind of harmony no one had thought of before. When the great English painter Sir Joshua Reynolds explained to his students in the Royal Academy that blue should not be put into the foreground of paintings, but should be reserved for the distant backgrounds, for the fading hills on the horizon. His rival, Gainsborough, so the story goes, wanted to prove that such academic rules are usually nonsense. He painted the famous Blue Boy, whose blue costume in the central foreground of the picture stands out triumphantly against the warm brown of the background. The truth is that it is impossible to lay down rules of this kind because one can never know in advance what effect the artist may wish to achieve. He may even want a shrill, jarring note if he happens to feel that that would be right. As there are no rules to tell us when a picture or a statue is right, it is usually impossible to explain in words exactly why we feel that it is a great work of art. But that does not mean that one work is just as good as any other, or that one cannot discuss matters of tastes. If they do nothing else, such discussions make us look at pictures, and the more we look at them, the more we notice points which have escaped us before. We begin to develop a feeling for the kind of harmony each generation of artists has tried to achieve. The greater our feeling for these harmonies, the more we shall enjoy them, and that, after all, is what matters. The old proverb that you cannot argue about matters of taste may well be true, but that should not conceal the fact that taste can be developed. This is again a matter of common experience, which everybody can test in a modest field. To people who are not used to drinking tea, one blend may taste exactly like another, but if they have the leisure, will, and opportunity to search out such refinements as there may be, they may develop into true connoisseurs who can distinguish exactly what type and mixture they prefer, and their greater knowledge is bound to add to their enjoyment of the choicest blends. Admittedly, taste in art is something indefinitely more complex than taste in food and drink. It is not only a matter of discovering various subtle flavors, it is something more serious and more important. After all, The great masters have given their all in these works. They have suffered for them, sweated blood over them, and least they have a right to ask of us is that we try to understand what they wanted to do. One never finishes learning about art. There are always new things to discover. Great works of art seem to look different every time one stands before them. They seem to be as inexhaustible and unpredictable as real human beings. It is an exciting world of its own, with its own strange laws and its own adventures. Nobody should think he knows all about it, for nobody does. Nothing perhaps is more important than just this, that to enjoy these works we must have a fresh mind, one which is ready to catch every hint and to respond to every hidden harmony. A mind, most of all, not cluttered up with long, high-sounding words and ready-made phrases. It is infinitely better not to know anything about art than to have the kind of half-knowledge which makes for snobbishness. The danger is very real. These are people, for instance, who have picked up the simple points I have tried to make in this chapter, and who understand that there are great works of art which have none of the obvious qualities of the beauty of expression or correct draughtsmanship, but who become so proud of their knowledge that they pretend to like only those works which are neither beautiful nor correctly drawn. They are always haunted by the fear that they might be considered uneducated if they confessed to liking a work which seems too obviously pleasant or moving. They end by being snobs who lose their true enjoyment of art and who call everything very interesting, which they really find somewhat repulsive. I should hate to be responsible for any similar misunderstanding. I would rather not be believed at all than be believed in such an uncritical way. In the chapters which follow, I shall discuss the history of art, that is, the history of buildings, of picture making, and of statue making. I think that knowing something of this history helps us to understand why artists worked in a particular way or why they aimed at certain effects. Most of all, it is a good way of sharpening our eyes for the particular characteristics of works of art, and of thereby increasing our sensitivity to the finer shades of difference. Perhaps it is the only way of learning to enjoy them in their own right, but no way is without its dangers. One sometimes sees people walking through a gallery, catalog in hand. Every time they stop in front of a picture, they eagerly search for its number. We can watch them thumbing through their books, and as soon as they have found the title or the name, they walk on. They might just as well have stayed at home, for they have hardly looked at the painting. They have only checked the catalog. It is a kind of mental short circuit which has nothing to do with enjoying a picture. People who have acquired some knowledge of art history are sometimes in danger of falling into a similar trap. When they see a work of art, they do not stay to look at it, but rather search their memory for its appropriate label. They may have heard that Rembrandt was famous for his chiaroscuro, which is the Italian technical term for light and shade, so they nod wisely when they see a Rembrandt, mumble, "wonderful chiaroscuro," and wander on to the next picture. I want to be quite frank about this danger of half-knowledge and snobbery, for we are all apt to succumb to such temptations, and a book like this could increase them. I should like to help to open eyes, not to loosen tongues. To talk cleverly about art is not very difficult, because the words critics used have been employed in so many different contexts that they have lost all precision. But to look at a picture with fresh eyes and to venture on a voyage of discovery into it is far more difficult, but also much more rewarding task. There is no telling what one might bring home from such a journey.